Great. Thank you so much today for joining us for this panel. We have Dr. Julie Snorek, Jack Algiere, and Chuck Currie here to talk with us about soil health. Laura, are you ready for slides with this? Good.
I thought I was.
Okay. You are good. Great. So just wanted to remind everybody of our working equity statement. We do encourage feedback on this. I'll read it for you. CMAP has recently begun the important and ongoing work of identifying our role in racial justice work. Recognizing the many gaps that currently exist in CMAP's work as it pertains to these issues, we are looking to take a more active role in building an equitable and representative CMAP community. We hope you will think about today's workshops with a racial justice lens. On our website, you will find a working equity statement prepared in consultation with CMAP staff, board members, and other ag stakeholders. We do really encourage your feedback at the link in the chat. Thank you. Great, and thank you to our sponsors. Again, Island Foundation, MDAR, Edible South Shore and South Coast, NOFA, as well as our USDA grant funders. All right, we've been through this once, but just to be sure, Laura, thank you for your tech support today. Make sure your name is correct and add your pronouns if you feel comfortable doing so. Please mute during the presentation, but share video if you would like. Use the chat function to ask questions. If you want to reach out to other participants, you can do that, share resources, offer comments. And then during the question and answer period, either use the chat function or you can raise a hand if you'd like to actually answer a question. Thank you. Great, and welcome to our panelists. Great, and so we are going to go through some short presentations and then start into some question and answers after that. Welcome, Julie.
Okay, thank you so much, Karen. It's so lovely to be a part of such an esteemed panel. Thank you for giving me the start off. I wanted to just start and tell you all just a little bit about myself and my background and what soil health means to me. I'm a social ecologist, and so that means that I look at how society is changing and evolving as our environment is shifting. And so really, I study climate change adaptation. That was my dissertation work. But my work now is really focused on how are we shifting towards a more regenerative society. And so I'm studying regenerative agriculture specifically in the Northeast and in the Great Plains as part of a National Science Foundation grant. But also I am a part of the core team for the Northeast Healthy Soils Network. And if you could go to the next slide, I'll just talk a little bit about who those folks are, what we're trying to do. So as part of the Northeast Healthy Soils Network, we are an organization that basically began in 2019 at Tufts University. And it was started as a conference, as a consortium of folks interested in thinking about soil health that came together to have discussions and to understand more what this means. And as a result of that meeting, we formed the Northeast Healthy Soils Network, which has continued on despite the pandemic, hosting events and trying to bring people together to connect ourselves in a bioregional network to focus more on the principles and the practices of healthy soil management. So really what we're doing is serving as a hub across the Northeast region. And there's a couple of other organizations that we sometimes partner with. And so we're really, each of the core group members is coming from a different state and a different region and one of those other hubs. So we have Anne-Marie Codure, who's at Tufts University, Sam Polson, who was at Tufts and now he's at Purdue, Aaron Jackson, who's at Tufts, and then Alyssa White, who's at University of Vermont, Josie Watson, who's at the Vermont Law School, Stephen Kelledy, who's our soil health and soil policy guru, and Julie Davidson, who is at a farm in New Hampshire, Stonewall Farm. as well as NOFA New Hampshire and myself. So through our work, we basically are trying to bring people together, and we really hope that anyone on this call, if you have interest in being a part of the network, I'd be happy to include you in our mailings. And also we're looking for technical expertise to support this network. So I'm going to stop there. I don't know if you want me to continue to go through and talk a little bit about my research now, or if that's going to come later as far as your questions go. So let me know, Karen, what we.
Yeah, I was thinking you would go through this at the beginning.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so some context, and then we can have Jack and Chuck talk after you're done.
Okay, fantastic. So let's go to the next slide. So in some of the research that I've been carrying out, and really this project just began, and so there's not a whole lot of results that I'll share from our current research, but last year, well, 2 years ago, in 2020, I basically went around the states of Vermont and New Hampshire and talked with people who basically called themselves regenerative farmers, as well as advocates who are working in that space and trying to train and teach people about what soil health means. And so through that research, I started to understand that there kind of were a way that people were going about this. And so that's what's coming through in this slide that I'm sharing here. And it's comparing the work of Sessions and Ness in 1984 on deep ecology to this kind of movement towards a more deep regenerative food system. And I think Ray Archuleta in his opening really gave us a lot of ideas as to how this is happening. So this is kind of a summary of what I feel are some of the main components that are bringing us towards greater soil health. It's not just an ecological change that's happening on farms. There's also changes that need to happen structurally and socially. So when you think about it, it's a qualitative change moving away from just focusing on yields per acre and really moving towards understanding the qualitative nature of the soil and how that's going to result in food. And so in some of the work that I've observed, people are looking at measuring nutrient density in foods and understanding how that measurement might change on the consumer level. Another element, of course, that Ray spoke about and that the soil health advocates really talk about is the need for diversity. But I wanted to bring up not just the need for diversity of types of species and crop rotations on the soil within our agricultural systems, but also diverse societal engagements. And so when we're thinking about the soil as a system, it's also important to involve a diversity of stakeholders. It's important to understand that a lot of these concepts, as far as regenerative goes and soil health goes, even though we think that we're talking about something different and new, this is a practice that's been engaged with for ages. And I want to say even millennia, in that we have knowledge from Indigenous people about how the soil should be protected, how the land needs to be managed in ways that will support our food systems. So thinking in ways that bring in also a diversity of knowledge, I think is important to this movement. Relocalization is also something that is essential and seems to be kind of emerging in this movement. And so there's kind of an engagement with local food systems, an importance for local, an understanding of how we as consumers can support the local. An engagement, especially that came out of the pandemic, of people wanting to buy directly from farms and signups for CSAs really increasing. So relocalization, not just a purchase power, but also thinking about relocalization of distribution. So having more centers for processing food that are local. All of these things I think will help to establish a movement towards regenerative. And then healthy people. So there's quite a lot of work being done on food as medicine, thinking about the pharmacy, so the farm as a place and how we're growing food is important to what our health outcomes will be. And some of that has been explained by looking at nutrient values of food from the 1930s and 1940s, before really we had our agricultural revolution, the green revolution, and the amount of nutrients in food at that time was much higher. So how do we get back to those nutrient levels? What are the ways that we can focus on health coming through our food? Stewardship also. So really understanding that humans are not just tilling the soil, and the soil is a medium for growing food, which is, as Ray was mentioning, kind of the way that people have been thinking about and training agronomists and others that were informing farmers, is to think in this mechanistic way about the soil. And so the soil really just was considered to be a medium. But when you're transitioning into a regenerative model of thinking, the farmer is the steward. The farmer is beholden to what's happening in the soil. And so it's this more of a serving of nature as opposed to a dominating of nature. Also thinking about payments for ecosystem services, that's what I mean by PES. And this might come through as a policy mechanism. I know in Vermont, which is the state where I live, there has been work towards paying people for phosphorus. And in other states as well, there's been experimentation with policy mechanisms and kind of different tests to understand if we can pay people for ecosystem services. There's also some movement towards carbon markets. And I know Indigo Ag, which is located in Massachusetts, has been working very diligently out in the Great Plains, where I currently am doing research, to try to enroll farmers who are engaging in soil health practices. So while I'm really unsure if carbon markets are the way forward to get us towards valuing our ecosystem services, I think having some kind of policy mechanism in place will be supportive of building more soil health. And the last two components that I want to talk about in this idea of a deep regenerative system are just really focusing on a healthy community. As Ray mentioned, again, we have a rural decline happening, maybe not as much in the Northeast, but definitely across the Midwest. And so a need to really understand and regain hope amongst farmers and set up again policy mechanisms so that farmers can maintain their practices despite increasing land prices and just inaccessibility to get land if you're a new farmer. And finally, I wanted to share an idea that came from a farmer on Studio Hill Farm, which is that regenerative practice or building soil health is really an action that is radical in some ways. And so by taking the stance and saying, we're gonna move in this direction to build soil health, we're gonna be a steward on the land. This is a practice that allows us to shift our whole system. So we need to see those who are doing it as really taking part in something that is beneficial to all, that they're actually in service to a broader community by supporting ecosystems, et cetera. And that has dynamics that reflect back to our ability to adapt to climate change events. Of course, we're seeing greater flooding in parts of the Northeast. And so if we have soil that has better infiltration and is just healthier in general, then we're able to withstand some of those effects and impacts of climate change as well. And I'm going to leave it there and let people ask questions later. So thank you very much for listening.
Sure, that's great. So we also have in the room tonight, sorry, let me just get back to the correct page. We have Jack Algiere and Chuck Currie, and wanted to give you guys a moment to, about up to 5 minutes to talk about your background and what soil health means to you. I don't know if Jack or Chuck wants to go first.
I'll go first. I guess, yeah, those are some of our farm pictures there. Yeah, just briefly, I studied plant, soil, and insect science at UMass Amherst, and then started farming while I was still in school. I started my first farm business in 2006 in Vermont, and then started this current farm, Freedom Food Farm, in 2012. It's located on 90 acres of Wampanoag land, now known as Raynham. We start out mostly vegetables, and I really like Ray's talk this morning because he, like how he came around and made the main point of regenerative agriculture and based off grazing and this relationship between land and people and plants and animals and really mimicking nature. Because when I started farming, my goal was always to have the most self-sufficient farm possible. Something that could continue producing food for people regardless of what sort of things happened in the world. Between shortage of fuel, wars, climate changes, disruptions, all those things. And so the more I've learned about nature and farming and ecology, it seemed like regenerative and rotational grazing was really some of the best ways that I could address soil health and carbon drawdown and regenerate the land and build organic matter on our farm. And so we started transitioning away from vegetables and putting more and more of our land into permanent pasture for animals. We graze cows and sheep, and we also raise pigs and chickens for meat and eggs as well on the land. And so as we kind of transition, from this tilled larger scale, it's still organic, but we did do a lot of tillage with our vegetables and transition to more pasture. We were able to kind of more intensively manage our vegetables since they're on smaller acreages and we could handle doing it by hand. And then we started learning more about no-till methods, what other vegetable farms had been working on in regards to no-till. And we started transferring the vegetables that we were growing into no-till methods. So currently at the farm, we have about a half acre that we manage through hand-powered no-till methods. We have another 2 or 3 acres that we manage through no-till or reduced till mechanical methods with some tractor work, but a lot of cover crop rolling, like Ray had talked about. We do some transferred mulch, different techniques to grain farming as well, working no-till grains into the rotation with the vegetables and animals. Then we also grow another half acre in greenhouses, which is also no-tilled, hand-powered, and that kind of gives us the opportunity to grow food year-round. That was kind of another focus of the farm, was to provide as much of a diverse diet as possible for as long as possible throughout the year, so we can get more people eating more local food. To supplement there's already abundance of local farms growing summer produce, but I felt like really what was missing was this extended diet of meats and grains and vegetables and greens during the winter as well. So over the last 10 years, we've kind of farm has transitioned some from more larger scale organic vegetable agriculture to regenerative. I think is a really good description of how we're farming there, where we're trying to mimic nature and have most of our land in permanent pastures grazed by ruminants, and then we're taking some of the nutrients and the manures from the animals and composting them and then using them for fertility for our vegetables. So now we don't have to buy in fertility either. And so it is, it takes some time to build sort of a farm ecosystem, but I think we made some progress in the last 10 years. And it's definitely been exciting to see what can be done on land. I think we had one other slide. If we can, I don't know if I can switch it. Or we can, yeah, or maybe there's one more too. But yeah, just a couple more pictures of the farm, winter greens in the greenhouse, and tomatoes in the greenhouse as well. Yeah, there you go. Some the no-tilled cover crops in the top left where we roll it and crimp it for planting different vegetable crops. Some of our cows out on pasture, cute little lamb. It's coming soon, the spring. And also another good sign I always like to see is when we have mushrooms fruiting in our soil. That means we have a fair bit of fungal activity happening in the soil, which is really important to the farm ecosystem. It's, because bacteria can survive tillage a lot better than fungus can. And so I think in our heavily tilled soils, it's fungi that are really going to be the organisms that are lacking the most, because they're, they have these long hyphae and they just get beat up so much by tillage that they struggle in a tilled system. So we've seen a lot of difference in our no-tilled areas with a lot more fungi coming up than compared to when we used to do tillage. So yeah, I'll hand it off to Jack. He can introduce himself, and we'll take any questions that people have.
Thank you, guys. Hi, and good morning. I'm Jack Algiere, and I'm the farm director here at Stone Barn Center in Pecanico in Hudson Valley. I moved here in 2003 to transition this farm that's here that has been farmed for many years and cared for back to Lenape. In this gorgeous landscape, which is only about 30 miles away from New York City. It's a 2,000 acre preserve with about 500 acres of open grasslands. So we manage with the state an ecological action plan and work for the service of this ecosystem. We have about 12 acres of vegetables and mixed grains and the surrounding ecosystem in grazing. The really amazing thing I've heard, the thread here through Ray and Julie and Chuck here is this integration that is so important to this whole thing. And what we're trying to do here for soil health is establish as much of a primary ecosystem, a primary agricultural ecosystem as we can. My track here, growing up on a small farm, going to school in Southern Rhode Island, going to school for plant science, and farming through college biodynamically, and continuing an organic path. As much as I have always appreciated the crop rotation, intensive crop rotations and soil health and stability and composting, cover cropping, it was in this past 20 years, especially the past maybe 10 years ago, I was able to actually figure out how to apply. Not even that I figured it out, I guess it was just more of a light bulb went off that these systems really should not be segregated. The grain systems and the animal pasture systems and vegetables are very interdependent of each other. And we've created a kind of agricultural system that does not respect that kind of interrelationship and has a direct effect on both ecological and social stability. So something that we were able to really dig into as an organization. I'm not sure if I have access to this, but if we click on, if you just click on the previous slide, Laura, that's a link. If you can open it, I'm not sure if you can, and you could scroll through down a little bit. We can move pretty quick through this, but I just wanted to show, this is some of the work we're doing here. One, as a farmer, we have this capacity to say, there's so much going on in our ecosystem, growing cover crops, diversified systems, animals on ground, is all wonderful. But it's often subjective in terms of what we're telling people or sharing. I think there's a great value in experience and trusting the farmers that are in our community and supporting them to do better. But it really does take this bigger network to get the point across to the artisans and consumers and researchers to be able to use an ecosystem together, and also some technology. So what we've been doing on the site here, what's being scrolled through is a report of what we do as a regular sort of living document on our ecosystems work with the state, that is integrated researchers from lots of different academic institutions, and we're studying deep soil carbon, soil health, plant biodiversity, insect biodiversity, bird species, plant transect biodiversity, native grasses, and multi-species management, and how they interact with each other. It continues to kind of liberate our thinking about this. You can see some of these maps that are passing. This is all GIS, so it's really complicated to keep track of this. And any of working with researchers, it's often very siloed in what someone will study when they come to work with you. And what we've been able to begin, I feel like it's been really active for many years, but I see a horizon here where multidisciplinary research can happen on our farms, and we need infrastructure, some actual physical infrastructure to support the farms in our regions, but also a lot of infrastructure for things like technology, like database. We use the GIS to help us track some really complicated stuff and keep us from having to transpose and to ask questions from these things. But more importantly, as researchers come to work with us, they have real data to work with, and the farmers that are in our network will continue to have access to this as we help develop apps and things like that. So I think this program has been wonderful, and it leads to a number of things. One is that Stone Barns is a nonprofit, 501c3, for training farmers and training artisans and chefs, but also more important, and really sharing what we do with a very broad audience. But more importantly, as we grow, using the nonprofit as a real hub for people to interact with, especially for researchers and farmers to be able to engage in this. And the networking that's happening, the Northeast network there is, I think, extraordinary. Soil Health Network, and more collaboration like that is really going to be necessary for us to make sure that our consumer mindset changes, and that we know how we're valuing our ecosystems and valuing the farming that we have. I think it's fairly easy to say that any farmer I know would love to continue to just care for their soil better and their systems better. But there's not a lot of backup support for valuing, not just monetary value, but just intrinsic values of what it means to care for. Why should we have farms in our ecosystem? Why should we have farms near us in town? They are incredible resources, both ecologically and socially. So working with public lands has been something that I've been very interested in. The state preserve is an incredible resource, and there's a mutual benefit that has been happening now for decades with us, that one supports the farming by not having to own hundreds of acres of land, and supports the landscape itself, the conservation work, by having real land stewards that are not using chemicals and not using huge amounts of machinery and labor, but using animals and using good agricultural systems to do that work in a much more sustainable way. So I'm going to leave it there, but as you scroll through here, I hope you've seen a few things, and I'd like to speak to some of these things as we get into our dialogue here. But I think this is such valuable work, and all of us have a role to play in the food system and the culture that we really want to create. So glad to have this dialogue together.
Thank you, Julie, Jack, and Chuck, for the introductions. We appreciate the background. And so I had a question about what changes you have seen in the health of local soils during your time in the ag world in farming. Anybody want to start?
Maybe I'll just continue for that one, if that's all right. Having been in this place for 20 years, and I can speak to what I've seen. Actually, all of us, I think everybody on this call is probably from the Northeast, if not Massachusetts. And I, like I said, I grew up in Rhode Island. So we all had similar soils. We had a lot of moraine soils, and here in New York, it's not that much different. We have sandy loams, relatively poor aggregate stability, not much clay to speak of, and so we have to be you have to be careful with it, delicate with it. It's one of the biggest issues. It's that just to not destroy the physical capacity of the soil to do what it needs to do biologically, chemically. So we've seen a huge change in the biodiversity that's there because of management. Pulse grazing and rich rotations have really made a huge difference in that. native grass return, water infiltration rate, better aggregate stability, moderated phosphorus. All of those things are where we see those specifically as the sort of key elements of that. There's another thing I would just mention too, because the farmland that we took on management of was conventionally managed for a long time, and we would see, I think this is really telling, that manure pies for the cattle would be, lay on the surface of the ground and sit there and just stay dry they could stay there for a year, like a fossil. And that was from the wormers that were being used pretty heavily in the breeding operations that were here before. And when we stopped using those type of chemicals, we saw the dung beetles come back, and we saw the manure pies being decomposed and digested from underneath. So, plant speciation changes the capacity for digestion of manure on the surface, water infiltration, all of those things, that the softness of the ground in general, all has improved, along with some real key, like, actual water holding capacity and infiltration and organic matter. But I think the big things are the visibles, like how can you really, you could see the ecosystem change, and that just takes time. It just takes time and persistence and adaptive management.
Thank you, Jack. Julie or Chuck, ready to go next? Julie looks ready.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up the element of compost in this system, and the importance of kind of returning the soil, returning the energy of the soil that we're taking out of it in local communities back to those areas. And I know that there's some kind of composting initiatives in Vermont and Burlington, the no waste compost food scrap pickup, as well as another one that I believe is in Lebanon, New Hampshire. But I think these types of kind of initiatives to return the compost from our food scraps that we're consuming in our local areas are really essential to building soil health. And someone else in the chat mentioned, what do you do on small scale pieces, smaller pieces of land where you can't integrate animals? And I think when you're thinking about, what do we do? What are different ways we can do things? And I know out here in the Midwest where I am right now, people are getting contracts with those who have animals, or, and that happens maybe on a small scale sometimes too, where people bring in sheep or goats in order to consume invasive species on their land, but also fertilize the soil. But yeah, compost, I think, is another way to do that, to connect with local farms that are producing compost from their manure, for example, or these other services that are being developed of food waste and food scraps.
Chuck, you want to add in?
Sure. Yeah, we've seen a lot of changes on our soil for sure, doing regenerative practices, especially with compost. We've had sections where they started around 2.5% when we first got to the farm, that are up around 5 or 6% just in 4 or 5 years. Although some of it's from cover cropping, some of it's from animal rotation, and some of it is from just adding compost, because you're adding organic matter, so it's hard to really tell how much percentage is coming from what. But definitely is increasing organic matter, and that means there's more carbon in the soil, which will help your farm be more productive, or your garden space, or your wherever you're growing food become more productive. To answer the question about the small scale, definitely there's a number of things like the compost, but also maybe if not many local farms are doing compost. There's a lot more manure out there than there is compost operations. So I suggest trying to find local places that have manure. Actually, in Massachusetts, all more common is going to be somebody with horses. Might have a neighbor or someone in the neighborhood who raises horses, and you can work with them to get some sort of composting operation going, where you can turn their horse manure into compost and use that to get organic matter into your land. And then also another small scale thing that can kind of mimic rotational grazing is, you have a lawn or any sort of grassland nearby, if you're mowing it according to voice and grass management systems, basically waiting until the grass comes almost to a mature stage and then cutting it, and then timing the the amount of the time interval between your cuts on the regrowing of the grass depending on the season. So you're cutting it faster and shorter intervals in the spring, longer intervals in the summer, and then kind of shorten them up a little bit in the fall if you have enough rain. And then taking all that grass, even if you have a lawnmower with a little bagger on it, taking all that grass, saving those grass clippings and using them as mulch in your food growing plots. That's basically mimicking a larger scale regenerative system, and you're sequestering carbon by managing your grass habitat in that manner. And then you're also adding carbon to your soil by having that grass kind of decompose and add to the soil instead of, who knows where it ends up when you, I don't know what people in the suburbs do with their grass clippings, but it probably doesn't all become carbon.
So Chuck is responding to a question in the chat, which I will actually just repeat for everybody to hear. So it's from Hannah, who says, how have you seen principles transferred to smaller scales, such as places that can't integrate animals into their landscapes? I don't know if Jack or Julie have something they want to say on that topic.
Well, I'll just add that I think that, there are different block sizes here of what you can do. And the wonderful thing about small scale, even though you may not have the space to do grazing or something like that in a garden, you can still apply the principles. And that's what's wonderful, is that the principles are fairly simple. And to raise points around mimicry, as best you can mimic a system in a small space. The idea of diversity and movement and manuring through compost, because you don't really want to be putting manures on small garden plots for the sake of biosecurity of that. But compost breaks that down. So using compost is a good way to mimic the inclusion of animals into systems like that. And that I think that even in the smaller community gardens and backyard gardens, there are a lot of great things that you could do. In fact, there are things you can do in small gardens that we wish we could do on the larger scale, because of the hands and the intercropping and you don't need rows. You can have better companionism and tighter companionism and that sort of thing, because you're just working with your fingers. And that is a great asset, a very different asset than we have at the acreage level.
Yeah, and I won't say a lot here because I already mentioned something, the point about composting with this question, but I think also, yeah, what Jack just said about just, the importance that in small spaces, we're able to do a lot because we have, we can work manually on those spaces. And so I attended a regenerative gardening session with Kat Buxton a couple of years ago, and she just talked about leaving all of what we call weeds in the ground and just cutting those plants with scissors. And so really, you can observe what's happening in your small ecosystem and just try to control for what you're looking to grow there. So if you want your tomato plants to grow and there's weeds growing around them, just leave the roots in the ground of those so-called weeds. Of course, we came up with that idea of what is a weed and what's not a weed, but and just cut it off so that so that it can't photosynthesize.
Can I try to take a shot at this question on bulb lengths? Actually, Chuck, you might have something to say here too. But, I love the question, so I'd like to take a shot at that.
Sure. This is from the chat, just let me repeat it. So how important is it to delay cutting hay to allow bobolinks to nest? This delays harvest significantly.
Yeah, no, that's totally true, and something we've been paying very close attention to. But I also just want to mention too, just something that Julie just said about weeds and even annual vegetables, is that the reality is we came up with the idea of an annual vegetable historically here, because those are the things that grew in the disturbed spaces. There's no vegetable permanent ecosystem. There are only the permanent perennial ecosystems. And when there's disturbance, the annuals can grow because they're kind of healing that spot. And I think it was revolutionary for me to recognize that there would not be an true sustainable annual system, that there needs to be rest and there needs to be perennialization stability in a system like that over long periods of time. I truly believe that now. But to answer to the bobolink question, they're wonderful creatures. They're flying from like Argentina, right? So they get here in May, first week in May, and all the males show up and they fill the fields, like, dozens and dozens of them. And they check what they're doing is they're looking for feed, bugs, and they're looking for nesting material. And the grass is growing rapidly at that time. The females come in that sort of last week in May, and the courtship begins, and they, all the males are kind of showing off their stuff. They're like, look at all the sticks here, and look at all the bugs I got for you, and this and that. They prepare, they start to nest. And right there, right at Memorial Day, right, it's like the first hay cut. And that can be really and completely destroy the system, that they've just did all this work to get to that. So that first week in June is a really critical nesting moment. And the way we've gone about that is just to be out there and observe where those nesting sites are, so that if you cut too much, you'll destroy their habitat and they'll just leave. And it's particularly bad if you wait into June, because then they've already started to nest, and the courtship is finished, they're nesting, they're laying, and that's a really critical moment to destroy their habitat. You can really ruin them. So what we try to do is flag the areas where they are and put big, sort of bubbles around those sections as we can. We can hit them at second cut. And generally speaking, once those birds fledge in early July, we can get another graze, or we're not necessarily cutting in those areas. We're doing a very early graze before the birds come in. The birds then nest and fledge, and then we bring the rotation of animals back into those sections. But what we've also recognized is the bobolinks generally choose fairly specific areas year after year. So you can kind of protect those areas. You don't have to stop paying entirely, but if you can identify where those birds are, you can give breaks and hit a later cut.
Excellent. There is a question from the chat I do want to get back to, and this is directed to Julie from Sister Anna. It says, good morning, Julie. An excellent presentation. I am curious how you will integrate BIPOC farmers of color into your research and reporting.
Great, thank you, Anna, so much for the question. And I want to start off just by saying that I think it's really crucial for us to be thinking about this, not just in research projects, but also in these networks that we're creating. And so as NOFA Massachusetts, as Northeast Healthy Soils Network, we need to be making a concerted effort to include people of color, Indigenous groups into our discussions, that their voices really are important here. And it takes effort to actually seek them out and figure out how to connect with those groups of people in ways that are meaningful. So I think that that's something just to put out there, that it's important to have that as a part of these discussions. In our research, this is a National Science Foundation funded project, and so we are making that concerted effort as best we can. So in the Great Plains, we've been talking with a lot of the Native American tribes, some of which are heavily engaged in farming activities as well as regenerative farming activities. In the Northeast, we've talked with people in the Abenaki tribe and been in communication with them about the Abenaki Land Link Initiative, which is where farmers who have access to land when Abenaki people may not have access are giving the plots of land to grow some of the indigenous seeds. And some of those seeds are quite adaptive to the soils because, again, they've been adapting those seeds for a long period of time in this area. And so a lot of the work to reestablish these sacred communities of seeds and to plant those seeds on, in our gardens or on our farmland, I think are really good initiatives to be thinking about. As far as the Black farming communities of practice, in my community, it's the Susu Community Farm. Soulfire Farm is a really wonderful example. I think that the work that they're doing as far as building social justice around farming and food access should be a big part of how we're talking about soil health and building healthy communities. That we need to be thinking about those who don't have access to healthy food. and thinking about how to bring those groups into these discussions, provide that access, open up community sources of food, whether it's a CSA or whether it's a community garden. So I think, again, like we have to be thinking creatively as far as how we're going to connect with people, whether we're farmers or food advocates or gardeners or just individuals. So thank you so much for that question, Anna. I appreciate that.
Good. All right, another question from the chat from Ellie. Could Jack say more about perennialization with regard to growing vegetables and annuals?
Happy to. And also Chuck alluded to this. So, Chuck, I don't know your system so well, but I heard you say just this, I'll name this, that we've started to pivot from, while we still have vegetable rotations that, 7 and 10-year rotations that have these fallow sections in them, 18-month fallows of clover or grain and things like that. We are, for the past 10 years, we've been taking a fairly significant acreage into what we call the lay rotation, which is a very old traditional rotation, European and English rotation that is really just designed. The herbal lay is really meant to be about 5 years in perennial pastures to forage cover crop to grain, clover, and then vegetable, and then back to perennial systems. Now, we obviously can't do in those systems really intensive vegetables like the carrot crops and lettuce, things like that, but we do all of our row crops in those types of systems: potatoes, winter squash, corn, soybeans, all those. And then we do, and that it comes after all of our small grains, so wheat, rye, barley, with undersown clover. So they're great systems but just to make the point about perennialization, annual vegetables play a really valuable part in that system, but they're a tool in an otherwise really complex kind of interaction between the grasses and the legumes and the annual grains, the annual grasses in these systems. They're all tools for doing everything from opening the deepest parts of the soil and bringing nutrients from below, to building carbon on the surface, to fixing nitrogen, to even fumigating soils and being good feedstock for animals intermittently. So there's a lot of balancing, again, very iterative and adaptive, because there is no single prescription for this. It's adaptive. So there are a lot of different practices we've done over the years. Different cropping timing has been a huge part of this, and very important timing for animal pulsing, when you bring what species and when you bring it in and for how long, is part of the big piece of big sort of clock of this thing. But Chuck, I've actually had that question for you, because I heard you kind of speak to it a little bit about integrating grain into the systems and stuff like that.
Yeah, I guess I could just briefly talk about our system. Yeah, that's Jack was a good point that annual vegetables are a response to soil disturbance. They're kind of like the earth trying to heal itself. It's like a scab, basically. There's been a wound inflicted on the earth, and nature is trying to cover up that wound as quickly as possible with something that grows really quickly, like vegetables. And so in our rotation, we're tilling once about every 7 years in our typical rotation, and that's actually to plant and harvest sweet potatoes, which require a significant amount of disturbance anyway to harvest. And so when we do disturb the soil, the first crop we plant is the vegetable, because that's the thing that grows quickly and is meant to kind of cover up the earth. And then in subsequent years, we'll plant another vegetable, since the soil's already been disturbed the second year. And then the third year, we're no-tilling in grain, which is more some of our mostly biennials that we're using. So we're planting them in the fall, and then they're being harvested the following year. And so that's like a longer growing crop. It doesn't grow as fast as vegetables, but it covers the soil for a longer period of time, builds more biomass, feeds the soil more with more biomass in the soil as well. And then we're interseeding other longer term crops and pasture plants into that grain as it's growing. So by the time we harvest that grain, underneath there's an understory of pasture plants, clovers, grasses, different legumes besides clover. And so that's kind of, and then that's staying as an ecosystem for the next 4 or 5 years until we come back and till it again for vegetables again in a year. So that's kind of like a successional planning of using annual plants, then transitioning into perennial plants.
Great. So we're coming off one of our wettest growing seasons ever here in southeastern Mass. How does extreme weather or other impacts of climate change relate to your soil work? How do you see the relationship evolving a few years down the road?
I'll throw something in the hat here. The weather, the wet weather, the big issue there is, I mean, it has pretty profound effects across the landscape as a whole. I think we were fortunate to have the foresight of caring for the land. So things like runoff or erosion is less of an issue for us because we have had so many years of stability. And I think that it shows in years like this. You often don't know how good a system is until you have extremes and see how they're able to be resilient. So in some ways, this gave us an opportunity to see things we hadn't seen before. Excessive rain events, particularly heavy, like very short period, high bursts, like high volume rainfall is probably the most impactful thing, because that's when, if the ground can't absorb it fast enough, it just rushes everything off the surface and it can really leach out a system. Pretty profound effects. The other thing with the animals is we saw increased pathology, right? We saw a lot of animal pathogens in a wet, hot summer like we had. One of the very difficult things is something like fly strike on sheep, which is can be really devastating. And the hot, wet weather requires very close attention to the animals. It's something that you can prevent, but you have to really be with the herd a lot. You have to be out there with the flock to be able to assess that and make sure that there is not compounding issues. So yeah, these hot, wet weathers, definitely for that. And I would say in terms of vegetables, we do a fair amount of greenhouse and tunnel type growing, even in our fields. And to me, that is a huge and a very important thing to integrate in growing practices going forward, is simple but effective tunneling and covers for heavy rain events and things like that, because it helps diversify our ability to have good production process.
Yeah, I can add about our experiences with the really wet season, and even, it seems like it's either the wettest season or the driest season that just happened. So a lot of times the regenerative practices, I think, really do help a lot with that. Rotation, a lot of compost, and keeping the soil covered, I think, is one of the biggest things, is making sure that that top layer of soil, once it's exposed, it just gets so beat up by the rain and the wind and the sun that it becomes just hard crust. And when it rains, all the water just runs off the surface instead of percolating down. So, it's like the difference between a parking lot and a field of grass. So, a lot of times after we have like a really wet season like that, I'll go to the conferences and everyone be like, oh boy, the other farmers I'm talking to, they're like, that was such a wet season and how'd you do? And oh man, then we'll be looking at slides of people's farms and everybody's fields are underwater and their crops are all underwater. And I'm thinking back, I'm like, well, it was really wet, but we never had any standing water or anything. So I think we've seen it firsthand that it makes a huge difference in the management of your managing for these regenerative principles of keeping your soil covered, keeping your soil health up. It's just, the soil can handle it if you treat it correctly. Nature, there's a lot of extreme weather events now, but there's been a lot of extreme weather events throughout Earth's history, and nature has developed ways of coping with that. And it's just, once humans came along, we screwed up a lot of those coping mechanisms they had. So if we can get back to the way nature coped with these extreme weather events, then I think we'll be in pretty good shape. And of course, to add to that too, that was a really good point with the greenhouses, because the one thing that is difficult that their soil can't necessarily help so much with is like fungal diseases on plants, especially since all these vegetable varieties we have been bred for certain weather conditions. They don't really have the genetic diversity anymore to withstand these extreme weather events. So the high tunnels do help with things that are susceptible to the fungal diseases brought on by wet weather. So things like tomatoes and squashes.
Unfortunately, we are going to have to wrap up. Thank you, Chuck, Julie, and Jack. Laura, could you put up the contact slide for the panelists, please? I think it's the last slide in the deck. Very good. So thank you again for your time today. If we didn't get to your questions today, we will get the questions to the presenters and get the answers in a follow-up. I'm sorry, there wasn't more time. It was a super discussion. I had a few more myself that I'm going to have to get an answer to. We are going to jump right into our next session. And so what I am going to share with you, you can go back to the original email for the chat for the Zoom links, but I am also going to, I think, successfully drop them in the Zoom room. So you can grab that contact information. It will also be in the follow-up email. And bye, Jack, Julie, and Chuck. We appreciate your time today.